At 3:08 a.m., the military Sealift Command Logistics Convoy, designated Gulf Convoy 7, was making 9 knots through the central Persian Gulf on a northwesterly heading toward Bahrain, 63 miles southeast of the Qatari coast and 41 miles southwest of the Iranian coastline off Bushehr. The convoy consisted of 7 vessels: the USNS Supply, a fast combat support ship carrying fuel, ammunition, and stores for the carrier strike group operations north of the strait; 2 chartered civilian tankers under U.S. military contract carrying aviation fuel and diesel; a Maersk-operated container ship carrying maintenance parts and ordnance components; and 3 additional support vessels carrying the logistics chain that sustained 4 weeks of the most intensive naval combat operations the Fifth Fleet had conducted in a generation. The convoy was escorted by 2 vessels, the USS Firebolt and USS Thunderbolt, Mark V patrol boats carrying 25mm cannons and crew-served heavy weapons, and was operating under the broader air cover umbrella of the theater air defense architecture rather than a dedicated surface combatant escort. The theater's destroyer and cruiser force had been fully committed to carrier strike group escort and theater missile defense positions. The convoy was the support structure. The support structure was not supposed to be the target. The IRGC Navy's operational planning had assessed the logistics convoy vulnerability for 9 months. The analysis had been blunt in its conclusions. American carrier strike group operations in the Gulf were sustained by a logistics chain that was substantially less protected than the combat elements it supported. A carrier strike group without aviation fuel and without ammunition is an expensive stationary platform. A carrier strike group that must divert combat escorts to protect its logistics convoys is a carrier strike group with reduced combat effectiveness. The IRGC's planners had concluded that attacking the logistics chain, not the combat vessels, which were excessively hardened and defended, but the support vessels that made those combat vessels effective, was the asymmetric operation most likely to produce strategic effect at acceptable cost. The plan they had developed combined 3 separate threat types in a coordinated sequence designed to overwhelm the light escort of a logistics convoy in a way that the convoy's dedicated air cover could not rapidly and completely defeat. The first threat type was the mine. Between 11 p.m. and 1:30 a.m., 4 IRGC Navy Tyre-class torpedo boats operating under emissions control, no radar, no radio, navigation by GPS only, had laid a pattern of 27 influence mines across the convoy's projected route in the channel north of the Qatar Exclusive Economic Zone. The mines were a combination of bottom influence mines that activated on the pressure and acoustic signatures of a large vessel passing overhead and moored contact mines at varying depths that addressed vessels with lower draft. The channel they had mined was not the convoy's primary planned route. It was the convoy's likely divert route, the channel that convoy routing doctrine would shift the group toward if the primary route showed elevated threat indicators. The IRGC's routing analysis had been based on 18 months of observing Gulf convoy traffic patterns. It was accurate. The second threat type was the drone swarm. 214 Shahed 136 variant maritime attack drones, modified with radar altimeters for sea-skimming flight profiles and carrying warheads optimized for ship penetration rather than the standard blast fragmentation variant, had been pre-positioned on 6 coastal launch rails at 3 sites along the Bushehr coast over the preceding 11 days. Not for this specific convoy, the IRGC's drone doctrine did not rely on convoy-specific targeting. The drones were positioned to execute a mass launch against whatever logistics or support shipping was in the designated engagement corridor at the time of execution. Gulf Convoy 7 was in that corridor at 3:08 a.m. The third threat type was the fast attack surface element. 36 Peykaap class and Blade Runner type fast attack craft were staged at the IRGC's forward operating position on Kish Island, 42 miles northwest of the convoy's 3:08 a.m. position. They had been at readiness since midnight, their crews at their stations, their engines warm, waiting for the execution signal that the IRGC's operational plan called for approximately 20 minutes into the drone swarm engagement after the convoy's defensive systems and its air cover had been committed to the drone intercept problem and before they had reconstituted for a surface threat engagement. The design was coherent. It was the most operationally sophisticated attack the IRGC Navy had attempted in the conflict, the product of 9 months of planning, 18 months of observation, and a genuine understanding of the vulnerabilities in the American logistics architecture. What it required to succeed was that the American surveillance and response architecture not detect and characterize all 3 threat elements with enough lead time to address them before they converged on the convoy. The IRGC's planning staff had assessed the detection risk for each element separately. The mine laying, conducted under strict emissions control, had not been detected. They were correct about that. The drone pre-positioning, assessed as ambiguous in its intent, had generated a Space Force alert, but not a targeting quality characterization. They were partially correct about that. The fast attack staging at Kish Island had been observed and characterized. They were wrong about that. At 9:17 p.m. the previous evening, a Space Force infrared pass over Kish Island had registered the thermal signatures of 36 marine engines being brought to warm idle status simultaneously, combined with the vehicle and personnel activity patterns at the fast attack staging pier that the pattern of life database associated with pre-operational readiness rather than routine maintenance. The intelligence fusion cell at Al Udeid had flagged the Kish Island activity at 9:44 p.m. and had begun cross-referencing it with the existing Gulf Convoy 7 routing data. The cross-reference was completed at 10:31 p.m. The threat assessment, Kish Island fast attack elements assessed as pre-positioned for logistics convoy attack, probable execution window between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., reached the convoy commander and the 5th Fleet Operations Center simultaneously at 10:47 p.m. The response to that assessment had spent the next 4 hours reshaping the threat environment that the IRGC's planners had designed their operation against. The convoy was not redirected. Redirecting it would alert the IRGC that the staging had been detected and would allow them to reset to a different execution timeline. Instead, the convoy continued on its planned route, while the assets that would address all 3 threat elements were repositioned around it without the IRGC's awareness. The Mark V patrol boats, Firebolt and Thunderbolt, were reinforced by 2 additional Mark VI patrol boats transferred from a Bahrain escort mission at 11:30 p.m. 4 AH-64E Apache Guardian attack helicopters from the 82nd Combat Aviation Brigade's forward element at Camp Beering in Kuwait were launched at 1 a.m. on a transit flight that placed them in a holding orbit 30 miles east of the convoy's position by 2:15 a.m. 2 MH-60R Seahawk helicopters from the USS Bataan, equipped with the AQS-22 airborne low-frequency sonar and the AN/APS-153 surface search radar, were forward deployed to a position 8 miles ahead of the convoy's route at 1:45 a.m., their mine detection systems active, their surface search radar sweeping the channel ahead. An AC-130J Ghostrider gunship that had been operating in the Qatar Overwatch role was repositioned at 2:30 a.m. to a holding orbit 15 miles north of the convoy, its sensor suite configured for surface search, and its weapons loaded for the fast attack engagement that the threat assessment had projected. At 3:08 a.m., when the IRGC Navy's operational plan reached its execution point, the threat environment it had been designed to exploit had been substantially modified. The IRGC did not know this. The drone swarm launched at 3:08 a.m., 214 maritime attack. Shaheds from 6 coastal rails at 3 Boucher sites. Their launches staggered across a 90-second window, their sea-skimming profiles activating as each drone descended to its attack altitude over the Gulf. The Space Force infrared alert reached the convoy's Tactical Operations Center at 3:08 a.m. and 22 seconds. The convoy had been at modified defense conditions since 10:47 p.m. The transition to full engagement posture took 31 seconds. The MH-60R Seahawks that had been mine hunting ahead of the convoy immediately shifted to surface search mode, their APS-153 radars acquiring the leading edge of the drone swarm at ranges of 18 to 22 miles. The theater air defense architecture engaged the drone swarm from multiple positions. The Patriot PAC-2 GEM battery at Al Udeid, repositioned 3 days earlier to a forward site that gave it coverage over the Central Gulf shipping corridor, began engaging the highest priority drones, the ones on direct azimuths to the USNS supply whose destruction would be the most strategically significant. At 3:14 a.m., the USS Bataan's rolling airframe missile launchers engaged the drones approaching from the northeast sector at 3:16 a.m., firing in ripple sequence against the dense cluster of drone contacts that the APS-153 radar was now painting at close range. The 4 Apache Guardians in their holding orbit 30 miles east dropped from altitude at 3:11 a.m., when the swarm launched, and were in the engagement area by 3:17 a.m., each aircraft carrying 8 AGM-114R Hellfire missiles and full loads of 70mm rockets, the engagement loadout that had been configured specifically for the mass drone threat when the aircraft were armed at Camp Buehring 8 hours before the mission. The Apaches worked the eastern and southern sectors of the swarm, the ones that had threaded past the outer intercept layers and were now within 12 miles of the convoy. The engagement was not elegant. 214 drones across a 12-mile front does not produce an elegant engagement. It produced a systematic, priority-sequenced destruction of threat after threat as the Apache crews worked their targeting systems at the tempo that 4 hours of IRGC drone hunting over 3 weeks of combat operations had developed in them. Hellfire against the largest targets, rockets against the smaller Blade Runner-scale drones that the swarm had mixed in for volume, cannon against anything that had penetrated to within 2 miles of a convoy vessel. Between the Patriot battery, the Bataan's Ram, and the 4 Apaches, 189 of the 214 maritime Shaheds were neutralized before reaching any convoy vessel. 25 survived to the convoy's immediate perimeter. The Mark V and Mark VI patrol boats engaged 14 with their 25mm chain guns at ranges between 800 and 300 meters. The remaining 11 Shaheds struck 3 vessels. 5 impacted the chartered civilian tanker carrying aviation fuel, 4 struck the container ship carrying ordnance components, and 2 reached the USNS supply itself. The tanker impacts ignited a fire in the fuel cargo compartment that the tanker's crew brought under control in 31 minutes, using the firefighting systems that MSC-chartered vessels operating in the conflict zone had been required to upgrade and verify before joining the convoy. 1 crew member sustained a burn injury. The container ship absorbed the 4 impacts in its forward cargo section, damaging 3 cargo containers and breaching the hull above the waterline in 1 location. No ordnance detonated from the cargo impacts. The ordnance was packaged per military safety standards that prevent sympathetic detonation from impact. The ship remained seaworthy. The 2 Shaheds that reached the USNS supply impacted the ship's superstructure and flight deck area respectively. The superstructure impact caused significant structural damage to an equipment room above the main deck. The flight deck impact destroyed a deck crane and damaged the landing surface. The supply remained operational. Her fuel and stores transfer capability was unaffected. The convoy had survived the drone swarm. It was damaged. It was operational. The mine threat materialized at 3:31 a.m., 23 minutes into the engagement. when the lead MH-60R Seahawk's mine detection sonar registered the first acoustic returns consistent with bottom influence mines in the channel ahead of the convoy's projected divert route, the route that convoy routing doctrine would recommend if the primary route showed elevated threat activity. The convoy's routing officer had received the recommendation to shift to the divert channel at 3:19 a.m., as the drone swarm engagement was still ongoing and the primary route's threat assessment was elevated. The MH-60R's mine detection alert at 3:31 a.m. stopped that shift before it executed. 27 mines in a pattern across the divert channel. The convoy held its position. The mine clearance mission began at 3:47 a.m., conducted by the Seahawk using its organic mine countermeasures systems and by a second MH-60R that had been launched from the Bataan when the mine alert was received. The channel was cleared or sufficiently surveyed to establish a safe transit corridor by 4:44 a.m. The convoy transited the cleared corridor beginning at 4:51 a.m. At 3:22 a.m., while the drone engagement was still in its final phase, the IRGC's operational plan triggered the fast attack surface element. The execute signal went out from the Kish Island Coordination Center at 3:22 a.m. The planned 20-minute delay after drone swarm launch had been compressed to 14 minutes because the drone swarm's attrition rate, visible to the IRGC observers on the Bushehr coast through the distinctive infrared signature of drone intercepts, had made it clear that the swarm was not achieving the planned disruption of the convoy's defensive focus. The 36 fast attack craft left the Kish Island Pier at 3:22 a.m. and turned southeast toward the convoy's position at their maximum speed of 40 knots. The AC-130J Ghostrider gunship that had been holding in its orbit 15 miles north of the convoy had been watching the Kish Island Pier since 2:30 a.m. Its sensor operator had logged the departure of 36 fast attack craft at 3:22 a.m. and had transmitted the contact report to the convoy's Tactical Operations Center at 3:22 a.m. and 14 seconds. The convoy commander acknowledged at 3:22 a.m. and 29 seconds. The Ghostrider was already computing its first firing solution. The AC-130J Ghostrider is not a subtle weapon. It is a 4-engine turboprop aircraft carrying a 105mm howitzer, a 40mm Bofors cannon, and a 25mm GAU-12 rotary cannon, along with precision-guided munitions that allow it to engage targets at standoff ranges beyond the effective weapons of most fast attack craft. Its endurance and its sensor suite, the combination of infrared, electro-optical, and radar systems that give it a comprehensive picture of the surface below, make it particularly effective against the fast attack swarm threat because it can maintain continuous engagement against multiple targets across a wide area in a way that point defense systems cannot. The Ghostrider's crew had been configured for this specific mission for 4 hours. They were not surprised by the 36 contacts moving toward them. The first 105mm round fired by the Ghostrider impacted the lead Peykaap-class fast attack craft at 3:29 a.m. at a range of 11 miles from the convoy's nearest vessel. The Peykaap was carrying 2 C-802 anti-ship missiles, the most capable anti-ship weapon in the IRGC Navy's fast attack inventory, a subsonic sea skimmer with a range of 120 kilometers and a warhead heavy enough to mission kill a destroyer. The C-802 had not been fired. The Peykaap that carried it ceased to exist as a functional platform before it reached its launch range. The Ghostrider shifted to its next target. The 105mm howitzer cycled. The Bofors engaged the faster Blade Runner craft that were attempting to use their speed to get inside the howitzer's optimal engagement geometry. The 4 Apaches, completing the final phase of the drone's swarm engagement, were redirected to the fast attack surface threat at 3:27 a.m. when the drone intercept count had reached 193 of 214. The Apaches transited north toward the incoming fast attack column at their maximum speed and arrived at engagement range at 3:33 a.m. The combined engagement of the Ghostrider and 4 Apaches against 36 fast attack craft over the following 22 minutes was one-sided, in the way that all well-prepared engagements are one-sided. The IRGC craft had speed and numbers. The American systems had precision, standoff range, and continuous sensor coverage that denied the fast attack crews any approach vector that was not already in a weapons solution. The Blade Runner craft that attempted to use speed and wavetop profiles to get inside the Apache engagement envelope found that the Apache's TADS/PNVS does not lose track of a surface contact at any sea state in this visibility condition. The Peykaap class vessels that attempted to launch their C-802 missiles at range found the Ghostrider's howitzer engaging their hulls before they reached launch range on 2 of the 3 that made the attempt. The third Peykaap launched its C-802 at 3:41 a.m. at a range of 31 miles from the convoy, inside the missile's maximum range, but outside its optimal engagement geometry given the convoy's maneuvering since the launch. The C-802 was acquired by the Bataan's ram system at 3:43 a.m. and intercepted at a range of 9 miles from the nearest convoy vessel. At 3:51 a.m., the last IRGC fast attack craft in the engagement area, a Blade Runner that had broken away from the formation at 3:38 a.m. and attempted to use the darkness and its minimal radar cross-section to approach the convoy from the south, was engaged by an Apache at 3:51 a.m. and 12 seconds. Hellfire. Confirmed as total loss of asset. 29 of the 36 fast attack craft were confirmed as destroyed or rendered inoperable in the engagement. 7 had turned back toward Kish Island before entering the Apache and Ghostrider engagement envelope. They were tracked. They reached Kish Island at 4:07 a.m., where the F/A-18E strike package that had launched from the USS Truman at 3:44 a.m. was already waiting for them. The Kish Island fast attack staging pier and the support infrastructure that had sustained the IRGC Navy's Kish Island operating element, the fuel storage, the maintenance buildings, the communications and coordination facility, was addressed by 16 GBU, 38 JDAM bombs between 4:19 a.m. and 4:22 a.m. The 7 returning fast attack craft had not yet docked when the first bombs fell. They stopped short of the pier and remained stationary in the harbor approach. They were not re-engaged. The pier they would have docked at no longer existed. Gulf Convoy 7 continued its transit to Bahrain, reaching the Naval Support Activities Logistics Pier at 7:44 a.m. The USNS Supplies crew had spent the transit repairing what could be repaired at sea. The deck crane was welded back to temporary service by 2 damage control specialists who worked through the remaining hours of darkness while the ship moved north. The chartered tanker's cargo fire had been fully extinguished by 4:17 a.m. The hull breach on the container ship had been shored from inside by the ship's engineering team. All 7 vessels arrived at Bahrain. All 7 transferred their cargo. The fuel reached the strike group. The ammunition reached the magazines. The parts reached the maintenance teams. The logistics chain that the IRGC had spent 9 months analyzing and planning to break had been bent, singed at its edges, and had arrived at its destination intact. The IRGC's operational plan had been the most sophisticated attack on an American logistics element since the convoy battles of the Second World War. It had combined 3 threat types with genuine tactical sophistication. It had correctly identified a real vulnerability in the American theater logistics architecture. It had failed because the specific convoy it had targeted had been under surveillance for 6 hours before execution, and had been reinforced by assets the IRGC's planning had not known were in position. The drones had been partially effective and then absorbed. The mines had been detected before they could be triggered. The fast attack element had been engaged before it reached weapons release range against any vessel other than the one that had launched its missile before being destroyed. The logistics chain was open. The campaign continued. The difference between the IRGC's planning model and the operational outcome was not a failure of planning competence. It was the difference between a plan that knew what the target looked like 9 months ago and a defense that knew what the threat looked like 6 hours ago. In the supply chain of modern warfare, the most important delivery is the one that arrives despite everything sent to stop it.